Thank you, Yerka. Can you hear me? I guess so. So, introduction to CSS for page media. I'm Tony Graham from Antenna House, who makes, would you believe, a CSS formatter for page media. There's quite a few people here today, which is encouraging and more than I expected, so thank you for coming. Before I really get started, I would like to know sort of who I'm talking to. How many of you are new to CSS to begin with? Any kind. There's a problem here because Mohammed answers this question every time. Didn't you learn anything last time? Obviously not. So how many people have used CSS for screen but not for print? Say half. How many people are already somewhat familiar with using CSS for page media? Okay, and how many would describe themselves as expert and are here just to sort of top up? The modest ones, they're all modest really, they're just sort of doing, yeah, I guess so. So if we go back to the dawn of history, or around 1995, a web page would have looked something like this. It's text, not particularly interesting, and as you would say, is somewhat lacking in styles. Oops. Mixing up my tabs and my... So the next step in this is the introduction of CSS 1.0 from 1996. Cover that a bit more tomorrow. And you can style your HTML for screen display. But at this point, there's really nothing for page media, for breaking this up into pages and what do you do with headers and footers, etc. Further down the track, the CSS working group introduced the generated content for page media module, the pages module, and the browsers pretty much present it exactly the same way without doing anything with the page media. The same sort of content in a formatter that can handle the CSS for page media could look something like this. The initial step is, of course, to define the page regions and so on. So if we go to step back a step, the way that the browser or the formatter finds the CSS style sheets is either through a link element in the meta which points to an external style sheet, or to a style element which contains the CSS styles as part of the HTML document. Part of what you can do with both of these is to provide a media attribute with a qualifier, which could be, for page media, would be print, with recent versions of XSL formatter. You could do a media equals AH formatter and put in styles that are specific to AH formatter, and would use extensions perhaps. What you put in your style sheet, CSS, one style sheet can import another. You can qualify and the style sheet that you're importing to be only used for when you're doing print media. The print qualifier at the end of the import is your media specifier. You can have media rules to contain CSS rules that apply only to print, and again ones that apply only to the screen, so that or ones that aren't qualified by an media rule would apply to all mediums. So you can separate out your print styles from your specific screen styles from the common styles. The obvious thing about page media is, of course, it's made up into pages. In CSS terms, there's the page area where the content of your document flows. There's the margin area where you put content in page margin boxes, as was mentioned in the Oxygen session this morning, and you can specify the height and the width of your page. In your browser, your page is the width of the window for the most part, and for the most part it just extends as far as necessary. In page media you have page breaks, and as we'll see, you want to control those page breaks. You set aspects of the page in a page rule. You can say things like the size of the margins, etc. You can specify the page size by specifying both the width and the height, or there's a selection of keywords that you can use for well-recognized page sizes like A4, landscape. They now do GIS B5 for use in Japan. And you can qualify this with a keyword portrait or landscape to say whether the A4, for example, is portrait or landscape. So you can have pages that are wide like this without having to go back to specifying the exact physical dimensions. Oh, pardon me. The margins for where you put your page margin boxes can either use the margin keyword to set the same margin for all the four sides of the page, or you can specify them individually. And being CSS, you could specify the margin shorthand and the specific margin property for one that would override the value that's used for all of the other margins. You can have named pages in CSS where the page rule is followed by a name. It's not a CSS keyword, it's a name that you provide that you'll use later. As you'll see here in a page property, this refers to a page size that we've specified. So we're saying that right here, landscape pages, we're going to use A4 in the landscape orientation. Portrait pages, A4 defaults to being portrait. And we're using these in our rule for tables in the wide table class, and the default we're using for all of our HTML is to use the portrait size. So you would expect that most pages are A4 portrait, and unsurprising, the wide tables we use a different page master. The way that CSS works, which is different from how XSLFO works, is that a table that specifies a page property it's an element that specifies a page property that is different from the current default starts a new page with that size page. So if in this token example document we have a table and we have a portrait page that's followed by a table, which is the wide table. So because the named page is different, we've stopped after the paragraph and we started a new page. If you were thinking in XSLFO terms, you set up your page masters beforehand for odd and even pages and so forth. You don't have this type of control without extensions or pre-processing your XSLFO. CSS, we've got the page rule, we've got the name for your named pages. You can qualify this with qualifiers like left, right, or first to set up different properties that will be used with, say, for example, obviously the left-hand side page or one of these named pages which is on the right-hand side, or for the first time that this named page is being used. Antennahouse adds extensions for if this is the last time you use this named page, or it's the only time there is no following page that uses the same page master. And what happens, again, as you would expect, the CSS, you can set up your basic named page, we'll call it chapter, set up the page size, etc. And then the page rule for chapter left, we qualify just some of the margins to override the default so that we have different margins on left and right pages, but we have the same page size for all of our chapters. And a feature of pages as we know them is that they could have headers and footers. In fact, this, what you're looking now, is of course formatted from HTML using CSS, and somewhat self-referentially, you're looking at a screenshot of one of the same pages. The headers and the footers, as was again referenced in the Oxygen XML session, CSS predefines 16 page margin boxes with predefined names, which are sort of hopefully self-evident. Top left corner goes across to top left, top center, and so on. And you can direct content into your page margin boxes. Before I keep talking about XSLFO, how many of us are familiar with XSLFO? Right, so who minds if I compare CSS and XSLFO as we go along? Nobody? Good. Because I did this at the last XMLPrague, and I said who was here for XSLFO or knew XSLFO, and it was completely irrelevant to them. But for those of you, the majority of you who are familiar, then I'll continue to explain the two concepts. A page margin box has to have content for it to be used. If you don't direct anything into a page margin box, then it takes zero size, and the remaining space on the top side or bottom of the page is taken up by the page margin boxes that you use. There's a sort of algorithm we'll cover shortly. It's similar to having a page margin box with display none, which in CSS terms means it doesn't contribute to the display. The rules are different for the page margin, the size of the page margin boxes, depending on whether it's a corner, a top or bottom, or a side, because fairly obviously the dimensions of a corner page margin box are already predetermined by the margins on your page. It's not going to be any different from the top margin and the left margin, top margin, and the right margin, or whatever. The top and bottom page margin boxes, the available width is the page width less, obviously, the left and right margins. And you can see there the border and padding on the page box itself. In the top and bottom margins, the center box, if you direct content into that, it's always centered with equal space on either side, so which makes it easy for what you often expect to see in a book, the section title, chapter title, or in the footer, the page number is right there in the center of the header or footer. You don't have to make any calculations or change anything to make that work. The way to direct content into, there's two ways, which we'll cover. You can direct strings that are copied from the content of the body of your HTML and used in the page margin boxes. In a page margin box, you use the content property, which is the standard CSS property for generator in this case, using content and placing it, as the content of an element, and we use the string function to get a string that we've defined before. So, for example, string chapter, we're using ordinarily the current value of the chapter string, which some other CSS rule has defined using the string set function. So in this case, H1, we use string set chapter, and we're using the content of the H1 element, in XSLT terms, the string value, which, if you might notice, isn't going to help you if, for example, your H1 includes some italic text. Many years ago, Dave Kramer from Hachette did a talk at the 2012 CSS workshop in Paris about the trouble they had with a book title that had a fancy swash ampersand in the middle of, as part of the book title. They had to use all three parts of the top page margin boxes to make text fancy ampersand and then the other text. So this is useful because it takes content from your document. I mean, it just copies it, but it has its limits because it's just the string. So bullet points to cover pretty much what I already said. In your CSS rule, you use string set to give a name for that you're going to use for the string content of the current element. And in the page margin box, you use the string function to refer to that. It's not just the string content. You can use counter, and CSS has ways of generating counters. You can count elements. There's a built-in counter for page numbers, etc. You can provide a fixed string as the value of a named string. You can use an attribute value with AH format, or you can select an attribute from an ancestor element. The string function, if you just provide the name, gets you the current value of the named string. You can qualify this with first or last, because it can happen that the elements that appear on the page, each of them might set the string value separately. I mean, the classic case is a dictionary, where your classic English dictionary, at least, on the top left of the header is the first word, the dictionary word that appears on that page, and then the top right is the last word that appears, last definition that appears on that page. So you can do things like that by qualifying string with first or last. The second way to get content into your page margin boxes is by using the running function, which you can style. You can style the content from the running, but the element that you use will also have its own style as well. So what we have here this is actually taken from the CSS for these slides. Ignoring how we got here, we're saying that this element, we're taking it out and using it as the running element with the name title. So that removes it from the flow. That's the distinction between strings and running elements, is it? You can style your running element, but it's also removed from the flow, which is part of why often when you're generating HTML for page media, you need to transform you're authoring HTML into something else to add extra elements that are going to be taken out to be used as running elements. There's proposals for CSS to have a mechanism to have your cake and eat it too, to have an element that appears in the content but is also reused in the page margin boxes, but that hasn't had any traction yet. So what we've done here is we styled our element, but it's taken out of the content and put into the page margin box. So in very poor accessibility, that is a running element in the page margin box on this page. In fact, that's the element. You can see the box for, that's the box for the page margin box. We have no other content in the other page margin boxes, so it can use the entire content. And that square there is the page area itself, and then this part here is the footer elements, and I sort of cheated a little and made it bigger than the margins. So as I said, as I mentioned previously, CSS has counters, including predefined ones for the current page and for the total number of pages in the document. So the way to get the page number in the footer and the total number, it's a bit hard to see because ordinarily I don't want you to see it, but that says 21/49, if I can read it correctly, which is going to be from, as it shows here, the count of page, the slash, and then the counter for the total number of pages. And as you might work out, it's smaller and fainter than the inherited, the text of the body. Oh, this is oh, come on. It's not advertising it very well. So, what you didn't see in the previous slide was a bleed. What you saw, the part you see most often is these parts. I'll go with that one. The green bar that appears on the outer edge of the page. Right, so forgot one of my visual aids. Still don't know. It's going to show awfully well on YouTube. Oh, missing. When you look at a copy of this CSS, Introduction to CSS for Page Media book, you'll see the index has a green bar down the side. This is done with making the margins for the page margin boxes on that side extend outside of the edge of the page. In real live printed books, there's often some sort of inaccuracy in how the page is cut after it's printed, because you're probably well aware that the pages, printed book pages are often printed multiple 16, 34, 32, 64 pages to a sheet and then it's folded and then it's all cut. There can be inaccuracies in the cutting, in the folding and the cutting. So sometimes you want content to bleed off the edge of the page to account for any possible inaccuracies in the cutting. So with your page margin boxes, you would use a negative page margin to bleed off the edge of the page, and then you need a mechanism to tell the formatter that there is a bleed area and it should be included in the output PDF. With AH formatter, well, bleed is a CSS property that tells you the extent of the bleed. So if we go back to here, we extended our margins 3 millimeters off each side. And here we're telling the formatter that every page has a 3 millimeter bleed. Because PDF, if you're producing PDF, has, it's more of the page. There's the page area, there's the bleed area, and then there's a crop area. And there are boxes in the PDF page model that PDF understands, your printer will understand, so that you can produce pages that include the, there's going to be a circle here, include the bleed area. And in an AH format extension here is that the page, the sheet that we produce in the PDF will be 14 millimeters wider than the actual page area itself. So in something like this, if you look at this, we have crop marks and the intersection of those ones is the actual page area itself. And the other squares are the, see, so there's the page area, and as you can see, the bleed extends outside the page area to take care of any inaccuracies in the cutting or the printing. This is a real live example. This is a real example from an earlier edition of the Introduction to CSS for Page Media book. There's side tabs on every page, and in one of these are from successive pages from one book. This page, the page was cut quite some distance from the nominal. This one is fairly close to the nominal edge of the page, and this one, the page was cut further in from what should have been the defined edge of the page. So the fact that there was a bleed on this side tab meant that when it was too wide, we didn't end up with a white line down the edge of the page. And this isn't, and for this one, you made sure to set the interesting content some distance in from the edge of the page, just in case there's any inaccuracy in the printing. If you're going to bleed, say, a photograph off the edge of the page, you should try and make sure that the interesting content, the people's heads and things, are a distance in from the edge of the page, because you don't want this sort of inaccuracy, meaning that someone's head's cut off there, or you see half a person or something. Because this is one of the things between differences between the physical and the So, okay, I'm well ahead of where I thought I would be. Are there any questions on CSS page media so far? Yes.
With setting, I know you were setting bleed and setting margins on your content to values that happen to be the same as the bleed. What would happen if you set, say you had a bleed of 3 mil, you set the margins on your content area to be like -10? Would that extra just vanish in the final render, or is it, I would think so?
For the video, the question was, if you bleed and the negative margins aren't the same, what's going to happen? Like 10 millimeter negative margin on a 3 millimeter bleed. You'll find that in the PDF it's cut off at 3 millimeters and it's not going to break anything. Any further questions before I go on to talking about PDF? So this is XKCD comic, which you probably recognize XKCD. This one is, of course, about PDF and about the relative longevity of different ways of presenting your information. It contends that a book on a subject is going to be accessible, well, basically forever until the paper degrades. If you put it in a web database, it'll work up until site goes down, back-end data not reachable. A mobile app, it lasts for a little while until the mobile OS updates or something else gets changed. Your software, it could go redundant with a change in operating system. A CD-ROM, we don't really use CD-ROMs anymore, but as it says here, it could get scratched and become unusable. Who still has a computer with a CD-ROM in it? A select few. I have one with an external CD-ROM, so. Microfilm will carry on, but a lot of these software solutions won't. PDF is designed to be forwards compatible so that you can continue to use it. It's gone through several revisions, and your PDF 1.3 will still open in your current PDF reader. So the PDF we'll start with PDF 1.3 came out in 2000. The current version is PDF 2.0, which there was an update on that. I think it still counts as PDF version 2.0, which was produced solely from ISO. It's not one of these ones that was an Adobe PDF rebadged as ISO PDF. But as I said, your PDF reader will still read your PDF 1.3 document. So there's also multiple PDF variants which you might have come across. PDF X is the one for PDF for exchanging with your print provider. It embeds all the graphics, etc., the color profile, so they can just take it and run with it. PDF A is for archiving. It also includes everything, but is a bit more constrained for sort of archive quality PDF that your future PDF reader will be able to open and get all the resources to accurately render your page for you. I don't know anything about PDF for engineering other than it exists. PDF VT is for things like Dear Tony in a form letter that I don't want to receive. And PDF UA for universal accessibility. That's a profile of PDF which specifies things that you need to do for improved accessibility for people with impairments, but also for people well, people like you and me, or like me, who sometimes need to use their glasses to look at things. So the first step for PDF UA is what's called tagged PDF. It's not a separate standard, it's part of what's in the PDF standard itself, but it's an optional thing. It includes extra information about the logical structure of the document. That's both in terms of structural tags, things like headings, you can say are headings, tables, have a structure in the tagged PDF that identifies rows, columns, and table cells. And it allows text and graphics to be extracted. I worked with something recently. It was a Word document that someone had, I think, screen scraped from, or extracted from a PDF. But what happened was that every line that ended with a hyphen, the hyphen from the PDF was missing in the Word document, because whatever had extracted it had assumed that hyphens were just word breaks. But of course, this was a document about XSLFO, so there's lots of hyphens in them, their property names, and you sort of had to mark up where to put them all back. And tagged PDF is also the first step towards accessible PDF, because you have this logical structure which a screen reader can use to present the information to assistive technology. So there's, at least in AH formatter, the different FO, or the different HTML elements in this case, have predefined PDF tags that they are mapped to. There's a lot of similarity between the names of the PDF tags and the names of the elements, and it's confusing to talk about it too, because I can talk about elements and tags and talk about elements, structural elements and tag names as well. AH formatter, you can give a specific name to an element in your CSS styles using the PDF tag extension. If you're using an FO formatter, FOP and renderx also provide ways to rename. PDF tags or override defaults. If you look at this, this is a table of contents from a book, and the PDF 1.7 provides specific structural elements for tables of contents. And it doesn't show. The PDF for this would have the table of contents items would be TOC-I and not div. Another thing about PDF tagging is that it can be verbose. Recent versions of AH formatter, you can effectively skip levels and say that this element doesn't contribute to the structure of the PDF tags. So tagged PDF will get you part of the way there. As I said, PDF UA ISO 14289 is sort of distillation of how to make accessible PDF. It has requirements, being an ISO standard, about what to do things. It tells you what to need to do so that content is presented in a logical reading order. I mean, how many of you have ever tried to copy from a PDF document and you've selected a 2-column content, you've selected some text and it's got the first line of the first column, and then it's hard. Yeah, so tagged PDF would keep those paragraphs together, and tagged PDF is a prerequisite, a requirement for PDF UA, so those sorts of things don't happen when you're reading, when assistive technology is reading it to a person. You need to specify the language, which could, for example, affect which text-to-speech reader is selected. You need to have alternate text for graphics and formulas. I mean, these are, you think of these as no-brainers, but it's also the sorts of things that you skip if you're in a hurry or whatever. PDF, there's an option in the sort of PDF metadata where you can deny access to assistive technologies as part of the security settings. If you've done that, then it's not PDF UA. It's fairly obviously. It's recommended to have bookmarks, the representation of the structure which Acrobat would render on the side of the screen, but an assistive technology device might provide it some other way to make it easier for people to navigate through the document. It can include annotations, links, and multimedia, and all fonts must be embedded. That's not so important for a screen reader, but it's important for presenting the information. Which brings me to the Matterhorn Protocol, which is published by the PDF Association. It's not what you think at first glance. It's a list of things that you can fail at making PDF UA. It's not what you need to do to make it. It's all the ways you could possibly fail. It's 31 checkpoints, 136 failure conditions, and the checkpoints are classified as whether a human needs to check it or a person needs to check it. Because things like the structure of the document, it might have a structure, it might not be correct. Does a figure have the right description? You don't. A computer's going to have trouble checking that. I keep coming back to tables because tables are hard to do even for visual people. So we have, wrong one. This first one here, a row has a header cell, but that header cell is not tagged as a header. So that's a failure condition. And at this point, you're going to have trouble finding a machine that will be able to work out that a row does or does not have a header cell that defines what it is. So PDF can also contain multiple properties. You probably, most of you have gone into Acrobat and looked at the document properties dialog box. You can set this from the PDF using meta with keywords, or these keywords, and provide the content. If the resolution was better, you'd be able to see that these boxes here contain this content. So before I move on to color, which has a lot to do with physical medium, are there any questions about PDF so far? So color, your computer, as you probably are well aware, uses RGB color. Colors are made up by adding red, green, and blue to make colors that are more and more like white. The way that you print, it's a really a four-color process where your inks are added to add up to make colors that come out more black. And the colors C, cyan, magenta, and yellow, and the K is black, which is added as well, because what tends to happen is that if you add a whole lot of cyan, magenta, and yellow, you end up with a sort of muddy brown color rather than an actual black. So the K stands for key, because it's the key by which all the other ones are registered, because when the thing is printed by overprinting with the different colors. CSS well, initially at least, defines the colors in terms of the sRGB color space, which is a subset of what we can see, but it covers most things. And CMYK colors a different subset of the colors that we can see. In some cases, you can make colors in RGB that won't be distinguishable as separate colors if you printed them. And in some cases, you can make colors on the page which won't show in your average RGB display. There's multiple ways of specifying colors in CSS. There's, of course, the color keywords. You can specify them as RGB components. There's an RGB function where you can specify the components as numbers or as percentages, and recent CSS has added colors with an alpha component. For colors with transparency, things that aren't completely solid colors. XSLFO, and I think CSS has RGB ICC where you can use a defined color space and the proportion of the color from that color space. There's also CMYK for specifying the colors as CMYK colors. If you're using AH format, you can also use Pantone colors. Pantone is a company that produces standard specifications of named colors. You pay a lot of money for Pantone. Other people pay a lot of money to get the details so they can reproduce your Pantone colors correctly on different types of surfaces. So Pantone, a Pantone color is essentially a solid color. If you're doing printing, it would be another pot of ink that gets used instead of or as well as the cyan, magenta, and yellow and black. So you say, I want to use this color, and you can specify the proportion of that color you want to use. So we can go from 0 to 1, which and if you're producing this on for a commercial printer, the printer would produce a separation that is purely just in shades of the Pantone color. What they produce isn't something in the particular green. They produce something in shades of gray, and that's the proportion of the solid ink color that they're going to use. Are there any questions so far? And again.
Is the RGB ICC part of the standard CSS color picture? Is that a print CSS specifically?
I can't tell you at this point because they're sort of incrementally improving the color thing, and I don't know for sure whether they got as far as ICC color profiles. I mean, they do other color spaces like HSL. So I can't say for sure. Ask me tomorrow. I'll look it up. Yes.
I think I do remember we once had a problem with a less to CSS compiler which did not pass the hash separation value through.
Okay.
That was not
No.
Because the hash would be expected to be followed by numbers. And
Yes, right, yes.
I think this issue got resolved by now, but nevertheless, I think this is at least a non-standard extension of antenna house, is it?
Well,
Separation word, keyword.
I don't know, well, the pound separation is a keyword that Antenna House would recognize, but I can't say what the standard would say about the token that you can put there. I mean, if it's a color profile name, then I don't know whether there's a standard that does or does not allow the hash sign as part of a color profile name, because in essence they are keyword color profile names that Antenna House would recognize and would use. I mean, same as the hash grayscale would recognize as being for monochrome things. So we've talked so far about CSS for page media as in the extra parts of CSS that you would use to make page media. We talked about PDF, which is the most common way of producing pages these days. We talked about color because the 4-color printing process is different from what you might be familiar with in making CSS for the screen. And now we're going to get into some of the sort of philosophical differences between content for the screen and content for the page. The first of these will be breaks, because obviously page media is broken up into pages. Floats, you can float content on a page more than you would in a long CSS document, because if you floated everything to the top or the bottom, then you'd easily lose track of what the graphic is and what it extends to. Navigation is the hints that you use on your page to show the reader where you are. The left and right pages aren't a concept in a single page on your screen, and there's aspects of the physical printed book which you don't have to think about if you're just producing something for the screen. So the reality is that breaks happen. Some of these do happen on your web page. Some, in fact, all of these would. Words can break across a line. A long word might need to be hyphenated. The browsers themselves have improved their hyphenation. Content can break across a line to make a new paragraph. And content can be in multiple columns in CSS on the screen as well. So the content might need to break onto another column, which of course really counts as another sort of line break or word break. But pages also break. You only have this much space, and what can happen, of course, is that you get to the bottom of the page, there's not enough space for the full paragraph, so part of it gets left behind and the rest continues on the next page, or part of it's on the current page and then a short piece is on the next line. These are called widows and orphans for the or orphans and widows, the one that's sort of left behind or the one that carries on alone, so to speak. What you'll find is that people have opposing definitions of which one's the widow and which one's the orphan, but that's true. And then people talk about paragraph widows and page widows. So these are the CSS XSLFO definition of orphans and widows. There's multiple navigation hints which you put on a page which quite often you're not really aware of, but they're there when you need them. We've talked about headers and footers. The function of the headers and footers is quite often to provide this sort of navigation, the page number, and quite often the chapter title, the section title, or even the book title is something you would put in the header and the footer. If you're still here later this afternoon, Liam Quinn will be talking long distance about accessible print and the need for some of these things. A book would tend to have a table of contents. This is a navigation that lets you quickly find parts of the book. You don't have full text search of a printed book, but quite often all you need is the section that you want to go to. Sometimes a book might have a short table of contents with just the chapter titles, and then a second table of contents with all of the sections, or an older book or a real reference book might have a list of the tables and a list of the figures as well. These are navigation aids to help you quickly get around the page, around the book. And of course you could have an index, which is both a navigation aid because you have subject headings and page references, but it's indexing itself is an art because it's a distillation of the essential topics of the book into keywords and sort of sub-index terms, so that you can quickly find the part that you want. I mean, yes, you have full text search, but you might be searching for a word that appears lots of times in the document, and then the full text search, you can't see the forest for the trees because there's so many hits on the word you're looking for. And a well-structured index, you look for the word, you find the relevant page, or you find the sub-entries for the different classifications for the keyword you're looking for. So these are essentials not just for page media, but also for your and my comprehension of the book. The other thing is, of course, we have left and right pages. We've seen this, you've seen that CSS supports this with the colon left, colon right qualifiers on the page rules. But the reason for this is that if you still don't have my book, the physical book, you open it up, the stuff near the margin is easy to see when you're flicking through the book. So you have things like the side tabs on the outside edges of the page. If these were all on, say, the left-hand side of the page, then you never see any of the ones on this side of the page if you're flicking through it. Page numbers tend to be near the outside of the page, so when you're flicking through the book, you can see the page numbers easily. And again, the chapter titles as a guide that you can see when you're flicking through the physical book, something that isn't quite as essential in online presentation. And quite often you need to qualify the first page because you don't need to reproduce the chapter title, usually anyway, on the page that has the chapter title there in big bold text. That's just redundant. And the other thing is that your printed book has a physical size, which could vary depending upon its use. It could be an office document, say you want to produce for, in Europe, A4, in the US, you'd produce for letter-sized pages. It could be a car owner manual. Do we have an example of a truck manual anywhere in the... There we go. That's sized for in the glove compartment of a truck, I assume. Hopefully. And I've got trade paperback here. In the US in particular, there's conventions for what they understand as a trade paperback. Standard sizes so that your book, for the most part, matches all the other books on a shelf, fits well in the bookseller's display, etc. Aspects of the printed book we've covered include bleeds, to take into account the fact that the folding and chopping of the book, the paper, isn't perfect. We're going to talk about spreads, binding, and show-through next. There are aspects of the physical book that you don't really have to see in electronic book. The binding method can affect the physical book. There's perfect binding where all the pages are butted together, one side is glued and then it's chopped, and so all the pages tend to be the same size. If your pages are folded together into signatures and then that's guillotined, you end up with little bits of creep on successive pages, and you can get imposition software which will adjust the offsets of the pages. If you tell it how many pages to a signature and how they're folded, it'll adjust it so that when everything's folded and printed, everything should still align without this sort of creep because of the extra thickness of the paper. Spreads. A 2-page spread in a printed book can have more visual impact than if you're looking at single pages in succession. Sometimes you need to, or you want to plan your pages as 2-page visual spreads rather than just having pages pour out as one after the other. An aspect of a physical book that you don't need to think about for electronic display is called show-through. If your paper is thin enough and your text is dark enough, then if there's the text on the back of the page can be visible through the page that you're reading. I mean, I could put anything over here and I wouldn't be able to see any sort of show-through. But this is a problem with a physical page. So when you're formatting your document, you want to align, it helps to try to align the text on a common baseline so that, as in here, one line of text is behind each other. You don't get distracted quite as much by the fact that there's there's text on the other side. Of course, if you have thicker paper, that's less of a problem, but thicker paper could cost more, take more space, etc. And somewhat ahead of time, a lot of this is covered in the CSS, Introduction to CSS for Page Media book, which is available from the Antenna House website. So thank you for your time. Are there any questions?
There's one interesting problem that you didn't mention that I'm currently facing, is that when you produce the cover for a book, and if the cover is to be there as one page for the front and the back side of the book, you have to calculate the width of the spine depending on the number of pages and the thickness of the pages.
Yes.
That's one you could have mentioned too, because it can be a lot of headaches.
So the comment was that the other problem with physical books is calculating the width of the spine and producing that correctly. Some of the print-on-demand services will tell you the width of the spine to use based on the number of pages, because it really does depend on the physical paper, how many pages there are, how thick they are, quite possibly on the binding method. Any further questions?
I would like to have your opinion about what's going to happen with this XMLPrague. Will you still need it in the end? Because I have a feeling that CSS is the future. It's easier than XMLPrague. You have less to learn, and many people know it already.
All right, so the question was, what's the future of XSLFO? Is CSS the future? Because CSS is easier, there's less to learn, and many people know it already. That's always an interesting question. XSLFO is still useful. In some ways, the page model of XSLFO and the fact you can put content in static content and direct it to different pages is more useful than the way CSS use strings or element. I mean, running elements are good, except you have to duplicate something and to put it in the in something in the content so that it can get taken out and put in the page margin box, which people don't. So you can't just go, I'll just take my HTML for the web page and print it, because you want to you need to transform it or do something with it to duplicate that content. There's another pass. So CSS, yes, see, the base syntax of CSS is simple. There's the selector, and then there's the properties, and which is a name and a property definition. But the selectors are getting more complex. The property definitions are getting more complex. I mean, I could show you the definition of properties for CSS Grid, which is you draw a picture of the thing and you can name the things, and then you can specify width, optional widths. And there's CSS properties, there's lots of them with different micro syntaxes. I mean, the ones that are just keywords, you can just use keywords, but some of them, you've got to put slashes in the right place. And while there's many people who know CSS, there's fewer that know CSS for paged media. Maybe they should come to a tutorial on CSS for paged media.
Well, I would challenge that CSS is easier. I don't think so. I don't think I could satisfy my client requirements using CSS for paged media at this point in its development. And I would echo the complexity of the selectors and such. When I try to help people understand FO, I just tell them it's the HTML for the page. If they already have to transform their XML into HTML, all they're doing is transforming their XML into the FO, which is a different vocabulary, but it's the same model. And later on this afternoon, I'll show how in one project that I'm on, we address both. But I'm curious in the audience who will say CSS is easy to use.
So the person who didn't know any CSS at the beginning of the thing says it's easy to use. Oh, I'm a success.
I would just to chime in. So I guess it's equally complex to understand if you have no previous knowledge. We assume that making the bridge for newcomers that might have an understanding of CSS for the web into expanding their knowledge to understand CSS page media, may have some basic understandings about selector preference, selector hierarchies, and so just learning more might be an easier sell to newcomers than, oh, there is this technology, XSLFO 1.1, that's stalled in
2006.
Exactly.
Nice, solid foundation.
Exactly.
No, 1.0 is 2001. 1.1 is 2006.
Since any format application handling page media has to do what every browser does, interpret the CSS and weigh all the rules against them to find out which ones to apply, leads to a worse performance based on an XSLFO file where you just have to look for your ancestors, basically.
But isn't CSS telling me how I want to format my page? And I don't want to format my page that way. I want to do footers differently. I don't want to split it into 3. I need to split it into 2 for some customers and 4
Well,
for others.
that's where you would have to somehow transform your source HTML into the HTML that you render, which has extra elements which are just designed to be taken out of the flow. I mean,
There's the extra transform then.
well, it depends on, well, all of these things depend on, your end point of this discussion often depends on your starting point in this discussion. I mean, many people would say, well, I'll just use JavaScript for this, and they'd write some sort of bespoke JavaScript to do it. Many people in this room would say, well, I could use XSLT to do this. And if you're using XSLFO, you're effectively doing the same thing. You're getting your content and you're generating your static content as static content, not as elements in the flow, which you're then going to expect to be taken out of the flow to make effectively static content. I had a thought, I lost it. I'm sure there's a question.
Something else I think we should notice about CSS part of HMedia, but I think the improvements of this transition is also the interactivity we get from the JavaScript frameworks out there. So a lot of the diagram systems and stuff are all built for this web interface. So by embracing this new way of doing print media, I think we're getting a lot from the web development.
Wait. So you're saying that the improvement for the graphics,
Not the graphics, but graphs, for example.
right?
You can go download a graph framework that works with, I think most of them work with prints. I think they also work with your guys and AJS and stuff. So I think you're getting more.
Right. So
Yeah.
So is it that you're saying the ecosystem of graph frameworks and other frameworks that work with HTML, is that,
Yeah, I think that's
right, yeah. Uh-huh.
I don't know. It's just my experience.
Right. Right. You can, well, I can, run AH formatter from Node.js and sort of do all of your processing with Node.js modules to generate HTML that you'd format with AH formatter. PDF these days can include JavaScript in that so that you can do some measure of interactivity. I have a really, it's not quite the same as graphs. Where am I?
I don't think interactivity is defined of the JavaScript. It's more like when doing billing receipts or booking confirmations, what else comes there. I think the close the one tool for the developers
Right.
is going to be the biggest change. Not
Right, so the
I don't know.
well, I'm trying to, if I re-articulate it to you, then it confirms that I know what you're trying to say. So it's the tooling around, as in the one method for making print and
Yeah.
web, yes. Okay. I remembered my thought from before. I mean, I don't have this distinction between formatting with CSS and formatting with XSLFO because AH formatter implements both and there's enormous crossover between the two, as well as extensions for improved formatting. And so a lot of what's available for FO is implemented for CSS, and what's available for CSS is implemented for XSLFO, as well as possibly even more properties which are extensions in AH formatter. So personally, I move between the two quite easily because it's all the same. It's all the same to me. So how many? the parochial question. How many people here use AH formatter? 40%? Oh, no, that's target market.
I use chemistry.
Yeah, that's good.
How many in the audience are using XLFO?
And CSS for page media. Right, so we had, hold on, all right, so I need to see this together. So one hand for using XSLFO, keep it up. Other hand for using CSS. That's the more accurate thing.
Now give you your word.
Court jester. So there's a large crossover here between XSLFO users and CSS users. And if you had a third hand, would you put it up for transitioning from XSLFO to CSS? All right. Or no?
How about the other way around? Who's interested in what FO can do for them? Now,
I'm interested if it can stop.
I didn't catch that.
So, I'm using XSLFO and I would like to stop.
Okay. Well, there's an easy transition to CSS page media with AH formatter. Another question, comment.
Not all PDFs are created automatically. And I have a customer who produces catalogs, and the luxury catalogs are produced with InDesign. Cheaper ones are created using XLFO. But sometimes people want to do some last-minute corrections in the output. And it would be easier if you could do that. If you attempt to do that, if you have an HTML document with CSS, then XLFO, and I think it does. Some small corrections, such as making a word bold or correcting some small word in text, maybe even widows and orphans.
Uh-huh.
You haven't thought about that? Many PDFs are created by InDesign required.
Okay.
Maybe not.
So the question / comment is many PDFs, in this case catalogs, are done by InDesign or Quark. In this case, the expensive ones are done with InDesign and the cheaper ones are batch formatted with XSLFO. And would it be easier to do it with CSS? Well, in principle, yes, because in principle, with your CSS, you could, well, obviously you could edit HTML to add style attributes. In something like AH formatter, you could make a separate CSS style sheet with the selectors for the elements that you want to change. Because CSS does everything in terms of elements. You don't do anything for, if text isn't marked up by elements, then CSS isn't going to help you. You can't change one word within a string of text. But if you had elements around the things that you potentially want to change, then in principle you could make a separate user CSS style sheet that had selectors for the elements that you're interested in and had the property overrides. And you'd make AH formatter use that as sort of the last style sheet in the cascade, so it has the greatest priority and they would override it. In other things, I've done internal systems where I sort of had an XML format for overrides, and that generated an XSLT style sheet, which was run on, sometimes it's run on the XML, sometimes it would be run on the FO, depending on the application. The XSLT generator is a bit like schematron. It has paths to match on specific contexts, and then in this case it would modify the properties. And produce the output with the modified one. I mean, I often think there's scope for some sort of standardized override mechanism for doing this, which would make these aspects of using XSLFO simpler. I mean, yes, it's baked into CSS in that you could provide a final user style sheet to do these things. Mohammed.
Or maybe it's a small elephant.
It's not the elephant it used to be, I don't think. I mean,
No. Is it bigger or smaller? Which direction do you?
I don't know. I mean, maybe I've changed the circles I move in, but I don't hear about it as much as I used to.
Yeah, but if you want to keep EPUB in the scope, using CSS might be like
Well, yes, that's true. So the comment was, if you want to keep EPUB in scope, then it would be better to use CSS than XSLFO. Or you could use something Ken's going to talk about and turn your XSLFO into something else. So, are there any further questions? No? Okay. Well, thank you again for your time. I'll give you 9 minutes of your life back.